If you've been on social media today, you've probably already heard about the so-called Biden boom. The basic idea is that thanks to Biden, the economy is booming and things are going wonderfully. Now, I'm going to talk about why that is not the case. I hate to burst your bubble if you're into this so-called Biden boom, but it's not a thing. Now, the reason this is trending today is because we just got the latest jobs report. And if you just look at the number of jobs and the unemployment rate, things are going pretty well. For example, about 500,000 jobs were added in March, which is a pretty high number. And that means that the unemployment rate dropped to about 3.7%. They also point out that average hourly wages are expected to rise by 0.4%. Now, all of those are good things. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that more people in the job force and increased wages are a bad thing, because they obviously are not. If you were to look just at these and measure the size or the scope of the economy solely by the number of people working and how much they made every year, then this would be a booming economy for sure. So let's just get a little bit more detail and then I'll explain why it's not a booming economy. You probably already know. Just don't spoil it yet. Let's just keep the myth going for a little bit longer. So like I said, about 500,000 jobs were added, which is less than in February, but it's still a lot of jobs. The unemployment rate dropped down to about 3.7%. And if you look at year-on-year wage gains, the Dow Jones expects about 5.5% compared to last February. So this is a 5.5% overall increase in your salary, which is certainly a good thing, because making more money is never a bad thing. Especially, let's round this up and say it's 6%. 6% increase in your income over 1 year is a pretty good raise, if you ask me. Now, as you might expect, since this article is from CNBC, they are much more likely to tote the positives of the economy, which is why they're leading with things like this. So to really find out why the economy isn't booming, at least not in the way people are claiming, we have to scroll down and scroll down and go a little bit further yet, and here we are. We're almost there. So we're talking still about the unemployment rate, and here we see that yes, we will see a 5.5% increase in hourly wages compared to last year, which is a good thing. But they finally bring up the real crux, the real issue with the economy, that the inflation rate is 7.9%. 7.9%, and it's perhaps even larger in March. It may have gone up. Let's just round it to 8%. So let's compare the 8% inflation rate with the rounded 6% wage increase rate. Now, like I said at the beginning, getting 6% more income is a good thing. But then when everything costs 8% more, you have lost money. Instead of actually getting a raise, it's kind of like you've been demoted. And to really understand how this affects real average Americans, we can look at an article from Bloomberg that just dropped. Now, remember, this article is from Bloomberg, so it's not like it's a right-wing publication by any means. And what they found is that this year, you're expected to pay about $5,000 more in just inflation costs. So sure, perhaps you got a small raise, but then all of that is washed out because you have to pay $5,000. Inflation is a tax. It's not really thought of that way too often, but as they say here in the Bloomberg article, it is a tax, and it is affecting, by and large, the poorest Americans. So Joe Biden, on the campaign trail, and to date, he still talks about how he won't tax anybody, he won't increase the tax rate for anyone making less than $400,000. That sounds nice and all, but we are paying $5,000 more on average because of the inflation rate. That is effectively increasing your tax rate because the inflation is 8%. That's a fairly large increase in how much you're paying. Now, the last thing I want to do is point out the hypocrisy of a lot of people on the left. And people on the right do this too. Don't think I'm just talking about Democrats right now. Republicans are also hypocrites in many ways. But right now, the Democrats are being more hypocritical. So when they tweet Biden boom, they're attributing this so-called booming economy to Joe Biden. They're saying he's doing a wonderful job and it's a rip-roaring time for everybody. Obviously, that's not true. But here's the real kicker. If you compare what we see now to what we saw pre-pandemic levels with Trump, the economy is quite a bit worse, actually, than it was. And in large part, that again deals with inflation, but also with just other things like unemployment and wage growth. Now, the reason I want to look at the pre-pandemic levels is because it's really disingenuous to compare the final numbers from Trump when he left office to what we're seeing now. And that's because we were in the middle of the pandemic and the vaccines were just beginning to roll out. We have now had the vaccines widely available for well over a year at this point. So comparing in the middle of a pandemic, the economy, to now we're basically out of the pandemic, that's not a fair comparison. It's extraordinarily disingenuous. So instead, let's look at what happened just right before the pandemic. And just to give you one really clear example, when we're looking at the unemployment rate, for example, in just 2 months, March and April of 2020, we lost 22 million jobs. Now, I know Democrats want to try and blame literally everything on President Trump, but that's not his fault. The world was artificially shut down. The world economy, not just the United States. So losing 22 million jobs in the span of 2 months, you cannot really blame that on Donald Trump. I mean, you can try, but it's very disingenuous. So let's actually compare more apples to apples, before the pandemic and now that we've effectively gotten out of the pandemic. So if we do that, we see right here, a month before widespread lockdowns shut down the entire economy, so in February of 2020, the unemployment rate stood at 3.5%, which was the lowest rate since December of 1969. Now, compare that to the unemployment rate we see now, which is expected to be 3.7, 3.8%. Obviously, it was lower back then, but the difference there isn't so dramatic. So I guess in that respect, you could say that it's roughly a comparable economy because we have more or less the same unemployment rate. But again, the big issue is with inflation, because even though we have job growth now, we had job growth then, the inflation of today just wipes out all of that job growth. So this section is what I really want to discuss, and I like the way they started. They say during Trump's 4 years in office, wages went up and inflation remained in check, which is a stark contrast to what we're seeing right now. And they point out that the consumer price index rose 7.6% under 4 years of President Trump, or an average of 1.9% each year. What that means is that the inflation rate for the first year under Biden rose more than it did for 4 whole years under Trump. That is an astounding number. And this is why I think it's so hypocritical of Democrats to try and talk about this Biden boom, how we have an incredible economy, and attribute it to Biden. Because back in 2020, if you remember, before the pandemic hit, they were trying to pretend like the economy, which in every respect was better then than it is now, was not doing well. They were saying that things were going poorly for real average Americans and that things sucked because of Trump. But now, when we have quantitatively a worse economy, somehow things are going well because Biden is in charge. I'm sorry, that's not how it worked. I fail to see how you can look at the numbers now compared to what they were under Trump and argue that the economy is doing better. It's not. If nothing else, you are losing $5,000 this year because of his inflation. So just to put in perspective a little bit more of the inflation rate, I know we can talk about numbers all day, but a graph is always easier to see. So here, this is the past, decade. What you can see is that under Trump's administration, things were, relatively flat. There was some variation, as there always will be. Even during the pandemic, when he spent a lot of money on, I would argue, non-necessary pandemic measures, things still, didn't skyrocket quite too much. That certainly affected the inflation rate, but it wasn't until Biden took office and then proposed and enacted more trillions of dollars of spending that were unnecessary that we saw this huge spike. Now, to be fair, I am not trying to pretend that the president has sole control over every aspect of the economy, because that is a very primitive understanding of the economy. It's a lot more complicated than that. The problem is, when you have people on social media attributing to Biden the good parts of the economy and then pretending that inflation somehow doesn't exist or it isn't his fault, that's ridiculous. So whether you're on the right or the left, that's not how the economy works. But we can say without a shadow of a doubt that the policies being enacted right now and what happened in 2021 has certainly contributed to this non-Biden boom.